VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And welcome to Crosstalk on the VCY America Network. My name is Jim Schneider. We're glad that you've joined us today. I believe you'll find today's program to be quite informative, especially if you've had questions about the Federal Reserve as to what it is, how it came into being, where does it get its source of authority and power here in the United States. And we're going to be talking about a number of related issues to that as we have with us today on Crosstalk G. Edward Griffin. He's a writer, he's a documentary film producer, he's a researcher, president of the American Media, a publishing and video production company in South Carolina. He's also founder and president of the Coalition for Visible Ballots and involved in numerous other endeavors. But today we've invited him on Crosstalk to speak of his book and research on the topic of the Federal Reserve and his book, which has been out since 1994, The Creature from Jekyll Island. And Ed, so nice to have you with us today here on Crosstalk.
Well, thanks, Jim. Thanks for inviting me.
Your book, originally published 1994, it's now in its fifth edition as you take a second look at the Federal Reserve. But let's begin with the title. You know, when I hear this title, The Creature from Jekyll Island, I think of this sea monster coming up out of the lagoon, a dominating influence over all the inhabitants. Tell us about the unique title, The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Well, I'm glad you got that image. I had fun with the title. You know, when you write a serious book like that, the worst thing that could happen is that people think, "Oh, that's boring. I don't want to read that." Yeah. So you have to do whatever you can to spruce it up a little bit. So I was thinking of various titles. I thought The Creature from Jekyll Island sounds like it might be a sequel to Jurassic Park or something like that. Mm. But as you already know, Jim, there's a significance to the title because Jekyll Island is a real island, and it's off the coast of Georgia. And it was on that island back in 1910 that the creature was born, and the creature, of course, is the Federal Reserve System. And it was a very historic event. As a matter of fact, just this last year, a lot of the top bankers, including Mr. Bernanke, went back to Jekyll Island to sort of pay homage to the roots of the Federal Reserve System.
Well, let's go back to that original meeting. How did it come about? How was it assembled? Who was there? What do we know about it?
Well, we know a lot about it now. It's interesting in retrospect because at the time that the meeting took place, those who participated in it were very hush-hush about it. In fact, it was one of the most covered-up and secret events that you could possibly imagine. There was more secrecy surrounding that meeting than I believe surrounds the plotting of most wars. So, I discovered a long time ago when things are done in secret, there's usually something to hide. And so I was curious, what were these guys trying to hide? So I'll give you a little bit of the story. It was, as I said, it was actually November of 1910 when a group of 6 men convened and got on board the private railroad car of Senator Nelson Aldrich, which was at the New Jersey Railroad Station. And these men were told to come to the railroad station one at a time, not to come together, not to be seen together, not to dine publicly, not to talk to newspaper reporters and all that sort of thing. One of them carried a big shotgun in a black case. Just in case if somebody had asked him where he was going, he was prepared to say he was going on a duck hunting trip. And we find out later from his children and his biographers who wrote about this event that he didn't own that gun. In fact, he never owned a gun in his life, never even fired a gun. He just borrowed it for deception. And when they got on board the train in the privacy of the senator's car, they were instructed, when talking to each other, not to use their last names, to use first names only. And when I read that, and the first time I read it, I thought, that doesn't sound right. Somebody's exaggerating. And then I came across the account written in the Saturday Evening Post by one of the men that participated in the event. And he said, yep, that's what happened. And then he explained why. Because they were concerned that the servants on board the train might figure out who all these people were. Now, the servants, of course, they worked for Senator Aldrich, and they might have known the identity of one or two of the others, but not all of them. And they were concerned that if the servants talked about this, said, guess who was on this train, and the word got out, well, then the whole purpose of this secret meeting would have been defeated. So, on and on and on. It was a very fascinating thing to see how much secrecy there was, and it leads one to the question of why the secrecy,
Sure.
Well, the answer to that question is very simple. You see, what they were doing is they were drafting the Federal Reserve Act. And at the time, that bill was being sold to the American public as a means of controlling the big banks in New York.
Oh, the bad guy.
Big, bad banks. This bill was going to put these bankers, in their place, and the people of the United States, through their elected representatives, were going to regulate and control the banks in the best interest of America. Well, had the people known that that bill was being written by the very people that it was supposed to control, well, then the scam would have been out in the open. And so these men were the epitome of the banking industry at that time. They represented altogether, it was estimated in the newspapers at that time, that if you added up the wealth that they personally held and the wealth that was controlled by their institutions that they represented, it represented about 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. So we were talking about, not little players. These are the big players on the world stage.
Now, you mentioned the meeting in the senator's boxcar, but aside from that senator, were there other political ties that they had to any political leaders or parties at that time?
No, these were bankers, and Nelson Aldrich, although he was the senator and the Republican whip in the Senate, he really had strong connections with banking, and he was a business associate with some of the most wealthy people in the world. He was a close business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr. Those were his circles. There was Abraham Piatt Andrew. He was one of them. He appeared to be a political figure because he was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury at that time. But that doesn't really describe him. He was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury because he came from banking circles, sort of like today. Who's the head of the Treasury? A banker, of course. That's the way it's always been. And Frank Vanderlip was one of those. He was the president of the National City Bank of New York, which was the most powerful of the banks at that time, representing the financial interests of William Rockefeller and the international investment banking house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. And Henry Davison was there. He was the senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Benjamin Strong was there. He was head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. Paul Warburg was there. He was probably the most important one in terms of knowledge of what they were doing because he was a full partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He was a naturalized American citizen, but his roots were in Europe. The Warburg banking dynasty was still being run by his brother, Max Warburg, and that was a big consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. So Warburg was the one that really understood what they were creating because they were trying to copy the model from Europe.
Well, so you have all these bankers who supposedly are drafting legislation, drafting this act that would actually, the propaganda said that, this is against the big bad bankers out there, and yet it's bankers who are drafting this.
Exactly, and that was the reason for the secrecy. And they openly admitted it in later years when it was too late to do anything about it. And in later years, after the Federal Reserve was firmly established and began to be revered in the minds of most Americans as some kind of a great institution, then they started openly admitting all of these things. Then they started writing about it. They gave interviews to newspaper reporters. A couple of these guys wrote books, and their biographers picked up segments and so forth. So later, they were all sort of claiming credit for having participated in it. But at the time, no, they couldn't let that be known.
So this act they drafted, was that eventually then passed by Congress?
Yeah, you bet it was passed by Congress. And most of the congressmen didn't really understand it. Then as now, they were more concerned with just getting elected, and their depth of understanding of some of these esoteric bills was not very deep. And all they heard was that, hey, this is good. This is going to control the banks, You ought to vote for this if you're a good American, if you're a good patriotic American, and you want to control those big bad bankers, then vote for this bill. Let the government run it, and that was about what they thought they were doing, but not what happened.
Your description of what happened on Jekyll Island, people have looked at this. They have called it conspiratorial, amateurish, and suspect. How do you respond to that?
Well, I don't care what they call it. It's just history. I mean, there's nothing that I've written about that isn't documented in the words of the participants themselves. I knew that was sort of a handicap that anyone has to take if they're going to talk about this event. So I made sure that everything I wrote was documented and from original sources. There are a lot of things that I believe happened, but I can't prove it, so I didn't write about it. Mm-hmm. I just wrote about the things I knew happened and was in part of the public record.
Now, many people think that Federal Reserve is actually part of the federal government, like the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Is this a part of our federal government?
Not really at all. It's the best way to describe the Federal Reserve System is what they use to describe it. It's a cartel. It's a banking cartel. It's no different than a sugar cartel, an oil cartel, peanut cartel. It's a banking cartel. It's composed of the member banks. They run it. They own it. They determine its policy. And like any cartel, it has one purpose, and that's to advance the best interests of the members of the cartel. Now, if they openly admitted that, the cartel would be dismantled probably by morning. So they have to go through a certain game. They play a certain game. The head of the Federal Reserve, the chairman at the time, makes his routine appearances before Congress and various committees, and he gives his testimony. And he said, well, we had to raise interest rates today, or we had to lower them, or we're concerned about the economy. Why are we doing these things? Because we care about you folks. We want to cool down inflation, or we want to stimulate employment, or we want to do whatever sounds good to the public ear. They wouldn't dare say, well, we did that because we thought we could rip off the public another $1 billion this week. Mm-hmm. Well, that wouldn't go very far.
Well, who controls who? Does Congress control the Federal Reserve? Does the Federal Reserve control Congress? Is there no control either way?
Well, there's an old saying, he who has the gold makes the golden rules. Mm-hmm. The money system in America is created and owned by the Federal Reserve. It's owned by the banks. The banks create the money. And Congress, over the years, gradually has learned its place. It's in second place. Congress needs money, right? All these guys, many of them, I should say, not all, but most of them are elected to office time after time because of the goodies they give away to their constituents, and that takes money. And so the Federal Reserve makes the money. People think that the government runs off of taxes, and that's a joke. The taxes are huge. There's no question about that. But Congress spends far, far more than they take in taxes. And the question is, well, where do they get that money? Well, they borrow it. Okay, that seems to be the answer. They borrow it from you and me and institutions, but they also borrow it from the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve doesn't have it. It just makes it out of nothing.
Wow. Well, we're going to pick up on that after the break. We're talking today with G. Edward Griffin, writer, researcher, film producer. He has authored the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, now in its 5th edition. We'll take a quick 60-second break and be right back.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, scientist with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, what do they mean when they say that we live in a three-dimensional universe?
Chris, the 3 dimensions make up volume. It's the length and breadth and height. The universe consists of these 3 dimensions. Sometimes time is called a 4th dimension, and in mathematical formulations it's helpful to conceive it that way. Recently, some scientists have suggested that the universe originally had 10 dimensions, that the equations for the Big Bang only work if there are 10 dimensions, not just 3 or 4. But this is totally imaginary. What's even more disturbing is that some Christians have jumped on this bandwagon and are saying that Genesis 1:1 speaks of a 10-dimensional universe. But there's absolutely no scientific or biblical reason to propose such an imaginary state. How much better to go back to Genesis and believe what's written there.
To discover more about the book of Genesis, please visit us on the web at icr.org.
listening to Crosstalk here on VCY America. We're speaking today with G. Edward Griffin. He is the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, giving us some great insight into the formation of the Federal Reserve, who they are, how it came about, the secrecy that was involved with this, and the way that they are functioning here today. And we're learning about the how money comes about, and many of us believe, well, it's just Congress that controls the money and dictates how much money to be printed and so on. But you use a term in your book, Ed, called the Mandrake mechanism. What do you mean by that, and how does that fit into our discussion here?
Yes, well, that's the title of the chapter where I take on the task of trying to explain just how the Federal Reserve makes money, how money comes into existence in America and in most parts of the world. And I use the Mandrake mechanism because when I was a kid back in the 40s, there was a comic book character by the name of Mandrake the Magician. And he was quite a guy. He had this big black cape, and he could wave that thing around, and things would materialize out of nothing. And then he could wave it again, and they would disappear. And that was his big trick, to make things appear and disappear. And I thought, boy, that's how the money supply is manipulated. So I call it the Mandrake mechanism, and it's fascinating. Most people have never even thought much about where money comes from and how it's created. So let me try and condense this down here. A moment ago, I mentioned that the Federal Reserve System was a cartel, which it certainly is. It's a banking cartel, but it's in partnership with the government. The government did legitimize it. The government actually passed the law which made that banking cartel agreement legally binding on everyone, including its own members. And, banks or any group of industries could have a cartel agreement, but it's always a problem of how do you enforce the agreement, If somebody wants to break out of the deal and say, I don't want to do this anymore, it's pretty hard to discipline members of a cartel. And that's why all cartelists like to go into partnership with governments, because they get the government to enforce it with the police and the army. And so now everybody's locked into the cartel agreement. That's basically what happened. So we must remember that the government is a partner in a very strong sense with this banking cartel.
Is that why we see, like, the Secretary of the Treasury's signature on every one of these Federal Reserve notes?
Well, yeah, that's more for show than anything else, to tell you the truth. At one time, it had some meaning because the government was backing those little pieces of paper with gold or silver. And that's the signature of the Secretary of the Treasury was sort of like a guarantee. He was certifying that there is gold or silver behind that little piece of paper. So it's more historic than anything else. Today, his signature doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have to be on there at all. It doesn't signify anything at all because there's nothing behind it. All they are promising to do is to replace it with a new one if it gets worn out.
Okay, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
But anyway, the reason I went into that little background, because I think it's important to know that there is a partnership between the government and the banks. And it's important when we understand how money comes into being, because with any partnership, there has to be an advantage for both partners or both sides, or they wouldn't do it. So let's start by saying, why is the government in this partnership? And that can be explained by how money comes into existence. So here we go. The Congress needs more money today. They always need more money in order to buy votes, basically, and conduct international wars and, grease the palms of their friends and all these things that governments always do.
You sound cynical.
I'm quite realistic, actually.
Yes.
No, that's what they do. Mm-hmm. And if anybody doubts that, I don't think they read the newspaper.
Yeah.
But anyway, so they always need more money. And they know that they can't tax the citizens for all of that money that they're spending, or they would become unpopular. So most politicians are always talking about how to lower taxes and increase benefits. Okay. Right away, you got a problem if you hear a politician saying that. But so what they do is they borrow the money, the shortfall. And the way they borrow it is they offer bonds or notes or T-bills or whatever it is, depending on the length of the loan. But it's basically a government IOU. And historically, there have always been a lot of people common citizens who will step forward and buy those IOUs from the government. They'll loan money to the government, in other words. And insurance companies will do it, and retirement funds will do it, and large institutions will do it. Foreigners will do it. Foreign countries will do it. And they'll actually buy the notes and the bills. In other words, they loan the money to the government. But what people miss is that there's always a shortfall. There's never enough coming from the private sector to absorb all of these loans that the government is pushing out. And the shortfall is picked up by the Federal Reserve System. So basically what that means is that let's imagine that the Secretary of the Treasury goes down to the Federal Reserve building, and he says, well, I need some more money today. And the chairman of the Federal Reserve says, well, how many billion do you need today? We just gave you, we loaned you $3 billion yesterday. Well, another $3 billion would be good today. So what the Federal Reserve chairman does, and this is all whimsical, you understand it, because it's really all done with a phone call and computers. Mm-hmm. But to visualize it, the Federal Reserve chairman pulls out the desk drawer, pulls out this big black checkbook, and he writes a check to the United States Treasury for, let's say, $3 billion. And the treasurer says, thank you very much. Down he goes. He deposits the check into the government's account. Now they have the money. Well, the question is, where did that money come from? Where did the Federal Reserve get that money to write that check or punch that computer key? And the amazing answer is the Federal Reserve does not have any money at all. What it does is it creates the money as a credit, a digital impulse in a computer or ink on a piece of paper. And that money just springs into being at the point where the Federal Reserve authorizes it to be created. And now it looks as though the government is borrowing money from the Federal Reserve, but it's not really that, because the Federal Reserve doesn't have any money. What's really happening is that the Federal Reserve is creating money on behalf of the federal government and doing it in such a way that it looks as though it's coming from the banking sector. But really, the government is authorizing it, demanding it, and so forth. It's just the same as running the printing presses. That's what they used to do. But that's too simple. It's easy to understand. You can see these printing presses whirring away and all these $1,000 bills coming off the end of it. And you say, hey, these guys are printing money. Mm-hmm. But when you do it through the Federal Reserve, it gets kind of mysterious. It looks as though maybe somebody had that money in the beginning and is actually loaning it to the federal government. So anyway, that's how the money comes into being for the government, and that's why the government likes it. That's why they're a partner in the deal. Because you understand then that it doesn't make any difference how much money the government needs. It can always go to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve will create it for them.
How does this relate to the bank bailouts? I mean, here we have bankers with the Federal Reserve, and yet we have both under the Bush administration and the Obama administration this bank bailout. What kind of impact is that on the American people then, when it seems kind of cyclical in that regard, just kind of a roundabout circle?
Yeah, well, remember, we got a partnership here. Now, the Federal Reserve legally cannot create money out of nothing unless the government asks them to. Well, that's a no-brainer because the government always is asking them to create money for them. But now we got a situation where the banks need this newly created money for themselves. So they can't just create it and give it to themselves. They've got to go to Congress, to their buddies in Congress, their former bankers who are now in the sitting in the Treasury office, and they say, "Come on, we need a couple of $1 trillion now to make up all these bad loans that we've given out over the years." So Congress says, "Well, we got to have some excuse to do that," and so they sit down and say, "Well, let's see what's excuse. Oh, I know. We'll save America. If we don't do this, America will collapse. It'll be good for the people. We got to tell everybody it's good for America, and that way they'll think we're doing the right thing." So they concoct some kind of a story like how essential it is, and if we don't do this, why we'll suddenly be living in caves, eating raw meat, or something, or some great disaster. The economy will collapse, and it could well be. It's going to happen anyway, I'm afraid. But anyway, they come up with some story, and the voters say, "Oh yeah, well we got to bail out the banks if we want to keep the economy going." So Congress votes for this, and that vote then is an instruction to the Federal Reserve to go ahead and create the money, give it to Congress, and then Congress can give it back to the banks and bail them out.
Wow. Where is this heading, Ed? If we continue on the course that we're at, where are we headed?
Well, we're heading down the drain. That's where we're headed. Every country that's done this sort of thing in history has gone down the drain. It's just destroyed itself. When the economy collapses, they know everybody's struggling for existence. People are out of work. There's usually civil disorder, there are riots, revolutions, famine. I mean, it's a horrible picture. It happens cyclically in history. And every time a country has debauched its monetary system and plundered the people, to feed the fat cats in charge, the country has collapsed, that's all. And I don't think that we have any get-out-of-jail-free cards. I don't think there are any exceptions. I'm afraid that's what we're facing.
Is there a way to correct the path that we're on?
Yeah, there is. Just stop what we're doing. Just stop this insanity of creating money out of nothing and plundering the American people in the name of saving America and all that sort of thing.
Is there a will to do that? I mean, we have seen bills come forth in Congress to even do a simple audit of the Federal Reserve, and these things go nowhere.
Oh, that's right. The congressmen and the senators are pretty much in the back pocket of the international banks because, they need the money. These political figures, unfortunately, most of them are there for their own personal advantage, not to serve the country. And so they'll do whatever, puts money in their pocket and gives them power and prestige. And so they know that if they came out and, as you just said, and supported a bill to audit the Fed, well, what's so harmful about that, you'd think? If they did that, they would lose their financial support. They would probably be pilloried in the press. All of the bad things that they do would be exposed.
Wow.
A lot of those people have skeletons in their closets, and
G. Edward Griffin is our guest here. The book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. For those who'd like to get a copy of the book, how can they do so?
Well, the easiest way is just to come on the Internet and come right to our website. It's called Reality Zone. That's realityzone.com. And the book is there, and actually it's one of about 100 different books and videos and audio productions that we have on this and related topics. So that's the best place. Come right to realityzone.com.
And folks, by the way, G. Edward Griffin is going to be speaking in southeast Wisconsin this weekend. He's going to get much more into this topic. This Saturday, February 11th, he is speaking before the Rock River Patriots, 1 o'clock p.m., The Real War on Terrorism, 6 p.m., Who Killed the American Economy, an update to The Creature from Jekyll Island. And this is taking place at the Olympia Resort and Conference Center in Oconomowoc, 1350 Royal Mile Road. And if you want more information on that, the number is 920-650-1260. We're going to take a quick 60-second break, and at the same time, let's open the phone lines and take your questions and comments today. Our call-in number is 800-733-9829. 800-733-9829. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America.
The tidal wave of Islam is sweeping across America. But do you know what Muslims believe? VCY America is making available a handy-sized booklet, The Facts on Islam, which spotlights Islam's explosive growth and increasing influence in the world. You'll find this booklet by apologists John Ankerberg and John Weldon a ready reference guide, answering many questions such as how did Islam begin? Who was Muhammad? What does jihad signify? Is Allah like the God of the Bible? What does Islam teach about Jesus Christ? Does the Quran deny the Bible? What basic problems does the Quran present to Muslims? And many other questions. The Facts on Islam booklet is available for a donation of $7 by writing VCY America at 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin 53208. Or you may make your donation by phone by calling 1-800-729-9829. That's toll-free, 1-800-729-9829.
program today, keeping you informed on vital issues that impact all of us. And today our topic is the Federal Reserve. G. Edward Griffin is our guest, and he is author of the book The Creature from Jekyll Island, now in its fifth edition. Before the break, in that last segment, we were talking about this mandrake mechanism, and we only got a portion of that discussion. But Ed, if you would just kind of wrap up some thoughts that you had pertaining to this mandrake mechanism.
Yeah, I took too long with it, but it's a fascinating topic, and I sometimes go down these little rabbit holes. But anyway, we talked about how the Federal Reserve can create money out of nothing and appear to be loaning it to the federal government. But that's only half of it, and that's just the beginning of the cycle. And that's bad enough, of course, but you ain't seen nothing yet until you follow the money. Let's say, why are the banks in this thing? This is why the government's in it, because they can get money easy. But why are the banks in it? And here's where the action heats up. Let's say $1,000 that's created out of nothing for the federal government, and that shows up in a paycheck to the fellow or lady that delivers our mail. Okay, now that person takes the $1,000 government check and deposits it into their personal checking account. Now the money is out of the government cycle, the Federal Reserve government cycle, and it's into the private banking cycle. We have a deposit now. Now, the banker, let's say I'm the banker, I could say, aha, I got a $1,000 deposit, and I can turn around now and loan up to $9,000 based on that $1,000 deposit. Well, how can I do that? It's because the Federal Reserve is running the show, and those are the rules. It says I can do it. It says as long as I keep 10% in reserve, I can loan 90%. Well, I'll take that $1,000 that was deposited, and I'll put it into a little account, and I'll call it reserve. So I've got my 10% reserve. 1,000 is 10% of 10,000, and therefore I can create 9,000 out of nothing. So for every $1 trillion that's created out of thin air for the federal government, by the time it gets into the private banks, they can create up to an additional $10 trillion out of thin air and collect interest on it in the form of personal loans for your car and your house and your credit card and so forth. This is where the action is. It's 9 times what they create for the federal government can be created by the private banks and put into the economy in the form of loans. And remember, they're collecting interest on nothing. Not too shabby.
Wow.
That is the reality of the mandrake mechanism today. And is it any wonder that the economy is staggering?
Folks, we're going to take your phone calls. Here's some startling information shared with us. Let's begin in Florida. Steve, you're on the air. Thanks for calling Crosstalk.
Thank you, Jim. Mr. Griffin, I read your book years ago as well as Eustace Mullins' book. There's only one presidential candidate who's even addressing these issues and would fix some of this. Would you talk about Dr. Ron Paul? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. That's, I think, the most important thing you could say about Ron Paul is that he is the only candidate who will tackle the two biggest issues facing America. One of them is American sovereignty. Are we giving up America? Are we going to be merged into a new world order, a United Nations collectivist morass? The leaders of both major political parties are just running as fast as they can to get rid of America as an independent nation. And the other big issue facing America is the banking system, the mandrake mechanism, the destruction of our economy. And Ron Paul is the only candidate that will deal with either of those topics. The rest of them, not a word on the most important things facing America, not a word. So what does that tell you? We only have one candidate for America.
Bartholomew in Kansas, you're on the air.
Hi, God bless both of you. My comment is, when I was in high school, I read the entire book of The Rise and the Fall of the Roman Empire, and everything that your guest is talking about reminds me of what truly brought down the Roman Empire, and it was as soon as they started playing around with their money, and the landowner class, who were the rich Etruscans, they were the ones who they started playing around with the money, and that began the downfall of the Roman Empire. And I'll hang up and take your comment off that.
Thank you.
Well, all I can do is say absolutely true. There's very little that's new in history, and what we're facing in America has happened many times before, and it just is a commentary, I think, is a proof of the fact that the average American today doesn't know history. They don't know important things about history.
Yeah, I've heard the comment made, one of the things we learn from history is that we don't learn from history.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Americans can tell you all kinds of batting averages and who scored the longest football run, and man, they got a lot of information, but they don't know anything about ancient history. They don't know anything about American history. They don't know why we even fought the American Revolution. Why did we fight that thing? Taxes, was that it? Oh, well, was it representation? Taxation without representation? What was it? What's this Stamp Act thing? What is that all about? They don't know anything like that, So, naturally, if you don't know anything about history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Let's go next to Waniwak, Wisconsin. Jim, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. I want to thank you for the work you're doing. In 1980, I read a book called None Dare Call It Conspiracy, which basically was saying the same thing. I remember the sentence the author said, there is no such thing as money, which is a 20-year-old at the time blew me away. And just last month, the second week of January, in the last page of Time magazine, they were interviewing Jimmy Carter, and they asked him just how much power does the American president have today, and former President Jimmy Carter said, most people in America don't realize the president is third. Number one, Federal Reserve. Number two, Congress. And number three, the president. I, again, will hang up and listen to your comments, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, who am I to argue with Jimmy Carter? I certainly agree that the president is not the most important power. I'm afraid that Congress has the potential for having power, but they don't exercise it. I mean, one of the most important acts that Congress can undertake is to determine whether we go to war or not. And Congress has just stood back and let the president do all of that. They don't even object if the president says, well, we're going to war. Or if, president issues an executive order and he says, well, we're going to embargo Iran because we don't like Iran. We're afraid that they're going to have nuclear weapons like many other countries do, and Congress doesn't say a word. They're afraid to speak up, and so I'm afraid Congress has abdicated its power. From my perspective, this may sound controversial, but anyway, it's my perspective. I think the real power is behind the scenes. We don't even read about in the newspaper. I think they're the faceless ones, or partially faceless ones, that work through and around the Council on Foreign Relations. These are the people that really determine everything.
Is there a tie between the Federal Reserve, the United Nations, the CFR, or the World Bank?
Well, as I look at it, I think the tie is more of a personal networking type of tie. I don't think you can probably uncover any documents that say this organization, feeds into that one and so forth. But these people meet, who dominate these organizations, they meet together quite regularly. Davos, and they meet in the Bilderberg group, and they meet at the Trilateral Commission. They meet in the Council on Foreign Relations. They have regular meetings going on all the time there. They travel around the world privately sometimes and just meet with each other. It's a kind of a tight-knit group. And I would answer by saying, yes, they're all tied together.
Let's pick up a call from Navarre, Florida. And Arthur, you're on the air.
Hi, how are you? Christ drove the money changers from the temple. The founding fathers of this country lambasted the money changers of the day. I can't recall who it was, referred to them as vipers, said that they would drive them out. So my question is, why have the people sat here and tolerated these alchemists to produce something out of nothing and parasitize all of humanity? They've inveigled their way into control over every economic enterprise of man. So what's it going to take for them to be gone? They serve no purpose. They parasitize and destroy societies.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with you. The only trouble is that not only are they parasites, but they now are in pretty firm control of the mechanisms of coercion. They dominate the governments of the world. And the governments, of course, are able to call up the armies and the police force. And so they're parasites, that's true, but they also have their hands on the levers of power over us. And so what's it going to take to break that is the big question, isn't it? I'm afraid it's going to take a massive awakening. First of all, I think most people are still pretty much asleep. They may be uncomfortable. They don't like what's happening, but they're not aroused enough to take an interest and find out what's behind it. The idea of most people is, well, if I'm out of a job, what I'll do is I'll just go out there and I'll wave a placard and say, I need a job, and ask the government to provide it for me, So they're asking for more of the very thing that put them out of the job in the first place, government intervention and, messing up the free market. So people are conditioned today to want more of the very thing that's killing them. They want more freebies, more government controls, more regulations, more, quote, benefits, and then they can't understand why the economy's falling apart.
Thank you, Arthur, for the call to Port Huron, Michigan. And Harry, you're on the air.
Hey, guys. I just wanted to ask, and I know this could hurt your book, but I'm just still wondering, being involved as I am with things, how in the world do we solve this problem? I know the one thing Ron Paul's been saying is to shut down the Fed. But what else after that?
Well, that's a topic that I've given a lot of thought to, and I think it's a really good question because when you think about it, there's no one thing that could be a magic bullet. Let's just mention Ron Paul again. I'm a big fan of Ron Paul, as you know. But, if Ron Paul were to be elected president, that's not going to solve our problems. One person in the White House, surrounded by how many hundreds of thousands of employees all working against him, surrounded by newspapers and television channels all over the country that are lambasting him and telling lies about him. One man in the White House with millions of people demanding more government benefits. No. The only thing that's going to change this is a broad spectrum approach where we change everything slowly, but everything at the same time, not just getting somebody elected or not just abolishing the Federal Reserve. Everything has to happen, a complete reawakening of certain principles that made this country great. We've got to get people thinking along the right line first. And that's the reason I created an organization called Freedom Force International. And I urge anybody that wants to become part of this broader movement to go to the Internet and look us up. It's freedomforceinternational.org. freedomforceinternational.org. And be prepared to spend some time reading that. And I've spent a lot of time trying to answer that excellent question. And I'll just repeat it. It's not just any one thing. We have to recapture the power centers of society. That means not only government, but we have to get into the schools, labor unions. We have to change the thinking of America first.
Harry, thank you for your call. We have one more break here and come back to the final segment as we're talking today with G. Edward Griffin, as he is the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, the topic, the Federal Reserve. We'll be back in 1 minute.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewweekend.com. Oftentimes it can be said that evangelicalism is only as deep as some of its leaders. One man who I think revealed his lack of theological and doctrinal understanding was sadly Billy Graham. I can give you many examples, but one would be on May 30th, 1997, when in an interview with David Frost, Graham declared, quote, "I think Islam is misunderstood, too, because Muhammad had a great respect for Jesus, and he called Jesus the greatest of the prophets except himself. And I think that we're closer to Islam than we really think we are," end quote. And let's make no mistake, the Jesus of the Quran is not the Jesus of the Bible. Yes, Muhammad thought Jesus was a prophet, but a prophet for Muhammad, to lay the foundation for the coming of Muhammad. That is not the Jesus of the Bible. And Islam is nowhere close to biblical Christianity. Again, perhaps evangelicalism today is so shallow because evangelicalism has been following shallow leaders.
You're listening to Crosstalk here on VCY America. Our guest is G. Edward Griffin, a writer, documentary film producer, a researcher, and author of numerous books, one of which we're talking about today, The Creature from Jekyll Island. As we're talking about the Federal Reserve, we trust you're finding the program to be informative in that regard. And by the way, Mr. Griffin's going to be speaking this Saturday in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin at the Olympia Resort and Conference Center. There's no cost to attend. It's free, but if you want more information, the number is 920-650-1260 for those of you in southeast Wisconsin. And again, that's located in Oconomowoc. Well, let's go back to the phone lines here today, and they are packed. Mike, you're next in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Thanks for calling Crosstalk.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for this program, very informative in the subject that you have to deal with the time that you have. Also, I appreciate you pointing out that Congressman Paul is the only person or candidate to address these things. And besides the internet sites that you've mentioned before, Congressman Paul's literature directs people to YouTube.
Okay, but Mike, do you have a question here for Mr. Griffin today?
Well, like I said, right now I'd like to refer people to the Federal Reserve on YouTube and pretty much applaud what he's been saying.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Rick in Navarre, Florida, you're on the air.
Yes, earlier in the program, Mr. Griffin mentioned that you used the phrase plunder the people to describe the eventual outcome of the money creation by the Fed using the fractional banking system, where for every $1,000 in his example that was created, the banks loan out another $9,000 for a total of $10,000. That's called fractional banking. That was used to create the bubble that caused the Great Depression during the 20s. And great fortunes were created at that time because of insider trading and funneling of loans to preferred people. The common people were indeed plundered. Now we're in a similar, some think we're in a depression right now. I'm one of them, a lot of people don't. But are the people being plundered again, and was the loan program to non-creditworthy borrowers for real estate simply a ruse to create the crisis by which the people could be plundered yet again?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that the plundering continues, and I think it's inevitable that it has to ramp up. The economy of this country has been pretty robust, and it was able to absorb some pretty hard blows, but there comes a time when you can't continue to absorb those blows. So much of the money that was created out of nothing and pushed into the economy went overseas. That's one of the reasons we haven't had as much inflation as you would expect, is because the world, up until recently, has always been hungry for American dollars. Their own monetary systems are even worse than ours, and so many countries couldn't conduct serious economic transactions using their local currency, so they always wanted American dollars. So we could create the dollars and buy things with them, and they go overseas, people would lap them up, and we escaped the effect of some of the effect, at least, of inflation. But now that whole thing is coming to an end. That chapter is coming to an end. And those overseas dollars are beginning to come back. People don't want them anymore. So they'll send them back to buy up whatever they can while they still have any value left. They'll buy up our refrigerators, our cars, and everybody will be happy. Oh, look, we're selling things again. But what they don't realize is that the money supply will be expanding rapidly, and that is leading inevitably to more and more inflation. I think this country is going to face inflation at a rate that was similar to the Weimar Republic in Germany, a couple of decades ago. It destroyed the country. And I think that's what's going to happen here, and I think that's how the people are plundered. It's through the loss of purchasing power. As inflation gets galloping, people will be able to buy less and less, and they won't be able to get more and more money from their wages. The cost of things will go up faster than their wages will, and that's where they'll be plundered.
Thank you, Rick. To Washington State, Sandy, thank you for your patience. You're on the air.
Yes, I heard him mentioning the Bilderbergers and Trilaterals and the CFRs. And these globalist elite bankers, they're tied in with them, definitely. Did you know that Rothschild, who is one of these Luciferian people that's up in this globalist elite order, did you know that one of his sons said, "Let me control the money of a nation, and I care not who rules the country"? Because they know that ultimately the big money controls the nation. And personally, I think that they are the harlot that rides the back of the beast in Revelations, because it says that the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies, and that she reigneth over the kings of the earth. And so they are in a position now where they're bringing the United States down economically to bring us into their one world order, and that's my comment.
Okay, thank you, Sandy.
You covered a lot of ground real fast there.
Well, let's pick up one last call from Pensacola, Florida. Ed, you're on the air.
Yeah, of course, I've been hearing about the Fed and dealing with the Fed, and Dr. Paul's dealt with the Fed, and I do believe that America needs to be weaned off of dependence on the Fed. But I think one of the great dangers that people need to be educated about is that, for instance, when President Jackson, which he was for sound money, and he was for dealing with he dealt with the National Bank. Don't remember the name for sure, but he ended up with a fight on his hands. And would you address the repercussions? And even though I'm for it, I think people need to be educated that, for instance, interest rates may be hiked up, and there could be the punishment of a president that opposes the Fed.
Absolutely. Not only the president, but anybody. There's no question. And let me back up a little bit in history. You're talking about Nicholas Biddle, who was the head of what we now call the Federal Reserve. It was the central bank.
By the way, Ed, we've got about 30 seconds here.
Oh, my gosh. Well, anyway, let me skip all over that then. Yes, I think that these people are not going to let go easily. They will do everything possible to cause destruction and to discipline those who try and challenge their authority. So like a drug addict getting off of drugs, there's going to be some kind of withdrawal, and it's not going to be pleasant, but we have to do it.
The Creature from Jekyll Island, you said it's available at realityzone.com.
Yes, indeed.
Great. Well, Ed, thank you for being with us here today.
All right, thanks for inviting me.
G. Edward Griffin has been our guest, and he is author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, as we've talked today about the Federal Reserve. Thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
Listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.